And I loved also the opening song from one of my favorite hymn writers, Charles Wesley. Now, I want to talk about him to you for just a moment here, and his brother John, and you'll see why in a few moments. Charles Wesley was part of the famous Wesley family from 18th century England, large religious family full of pastors and theologians. Charles was the poet of the family. He wrote over 4,500 poems. He was also a pastor, I believe, but he lived at a time when you could stay home and write poetry and make money. I wish I could do that, because I love to write poetry, but I don't know any way to make money out of it. But he wrote 4,500 hymns, was very, very prolific. But his more famous brother was John, the great preacher. And John basically raised up the Methodist Church and took it from 4 members when he started to 132,000 members in his lifetime, largely due to his extensive travel. John traveled on horseback 250,000 miles in his life. That's enough to go around the world 10 times. If you could ride through the oceans, you know what I'm saying. But this is my point here, that when we talk about domestic violence, typically the coercive type of domestic violence is perpetrated by the man upon the woman. In John Wesley's experience, it was the opposite. He was an exception. Our sermon today is going to be addressing another exception, but that's why I'm mentioning John Wesley. John Wesley was a small man, not much bigger than me, and his wife, Mary Wesley, was physically abusive to him. In fact, an eyewitness once saw John dragged across the floor by Mary by his hair. The men had long hair in those days, and she dragged him across the floor. So at one point, Charles, his poet brother, quipped, "I have the kind of marriage," and he had a very happy marriage, "that is conducive to me staying home and writing poetry. But my brother John has the kind of marriage that compels him to go out and preach the gospel." And so we have his abusive marriage, honestly, to thank for the prolific nature of his career. But again, he was an exception to the rule of who usually perpetrates the domestic violence, the man or the woman. Today, we're going to be looking at a different exception to the rule in the area of sexual assault. Most sexual assaults are men against women. 9 out of 10 rapes are males raping females. I don't mean to be graphic here. I won't do that very much, but I'm just mentioning that stat to you because it applies. Today we're going to address a time when a female assaulted a male and then went on to claim, to falsely report that he had assaulted her. I'm speaking of the story of Potiphar's wife, found in the 39th chapter of the book of Genesis. Go ahead and look it up if you like. Potiphar's wife has gone down in history as one of the bad girls of the Bible. This subject is very meaningful to me because I work in abuse prevention and response within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Some friends of mine and I have set up a ministry called Project Safe Church. We've been contracted with one union and are negotiating with other unions in our division to consult with them and train them in implementing an abuse response system. Part of the reason that abuse doesn't get handled well in our church sometimes, particularly sexual abuse, and particularly sexual abuse perpetrated by spiritual leaders, is because we don't have a good system in place. When there's a system in place, then you don't just scramble at the last minute to try to figure out what to do. You have a protocol, a series of steps you follow, and so we're trying to get that done so that we can be an example to the world of how to keep our side of the street clean. You know what I mean? Like sweep our side of the street and make sure that our church is a safe place. We can't have church be a safe place while it's a safe place for unsafe people. And so we want to work hard to bring that about. So the subject of false allegations of sexual assault is a very meaningful subject to me. If I and my team members in abuse response work could get a nickel for every time someone says to us, "She could be lying," I could retire in luxury right now, because that's often the first place people go. And so this is a very meaningful subject to me, because it's a time when a woman was lying. This is what I tweeted out this week. I said, for our Journey Through Genesis series, my pastors invited me to preach on Genesis 39, Potiphar's wife. I'll touch on Me Too, rape reporting, false allegations, abuse psychology, stuff like that. So glad they didn't give me any heavy lifting, light, fluffy stuff for the women speakers. So what I'm going to attempt this morning through the story of Potiphar's wife is not only to address the issue of false allegations, but to show how God works in our behalf generally when dishonest people misrepresent us. Most of us haven't experienced false allegations of sexual abuse, but I think almost all of us have been lied about at some point in our lives. It's a very distressing experience. It's hard to be lied about. God knows that, and we're going to see how he shines through. So let me first give you the basic storyline of Genesis 39, and you can follow along with me. I'll be reading some of the verses. We know that Joseph was sold as a slave to the Midianite traders, who then took him to Egypt, which was the hub of commercial activity and the place where they could fetch the highest price for a slave. And Joseph was purchased by a high-ranking official under Pharaoh, a man named Potiphar. And he took Joseph into his household as an entry-level slave, so to speak. But Joseph had this characteristic, and you're going to see it throughout the story, that everything he touched flourished. And so everything around Joseph began to flourish because he had the Spirit of God. And Potiphar took notice and promoted Joseph to the head servant over his household and gardens. The Bible goes out of its way to mention that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Not very many men are mentioned in Scripture as handsome. You know, it tends not to matter as much if men are good looking. You see these supermodels, and their husband is some famous guy, but he looks like a mud fence, if you know what I mean, you know. It's true, you know. For women, you know, their physical appearance is an important part of their social currency, because we tend not to have as much social currency in other areas. And the Bible seems to kind of affirm that in a way, because it only mentions that I know of 3 men as being handsome: Absalom, David, and Joseph. But the following women are mentioned as beautiful: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Esther, Abigail, Bathsheba, David's concubine Abishag, Tamar, Solomon's crush, whose name we never learn. And I think the list goes on, but that's many more than what I could find for men being mentioned as handsome. So in light of the fact that he was handsome, you know, men are very visual creatures, I think more so than women. But women are also visual, and truth be told, we like a good-looking man. It's pleasant to the eyes. And so let's have a little compassion on Mrs. Potiphar, because here she is in the household day after day with this strapping, handsome young man that not only was good-looking, but had an elegant and charismatic personality and strong capabilities and all the qualities that women are attracted to in a man. And there's a chance that she was very unfulfilled in her love life, because Potiphar may have been a eunuch. I don't want to go too deep into that, but, you know, she may have unfulfilled longings here. And here's this handsome young man. She developed a crush on him, apparently. Now, we all experience crushes at different times in our lives. You know, they're innocent enough, but it's what you do with a crush that ultimately matters. If you nurse the crush, if you fantasize about the person and this type of thing, it's going to lead you down a very dark path. And that's what happened to Mrs. Potiphar. She exploited her crush by acting out, thinking that no slave in his right mind would refuse her. But she underestimated the power of principle in the heart of this godly young man. So day after day, she cast longing eyes upon him and said, "Lie with me." Joseph's response is worth reading verbatim if you turn with me to Genesis 39 and verse 9. This is his response to Mrs. Potiphar. "Look, My master has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Well, there's two concerns here that he expresses. One is that he doesn't want to sin against Potiphar. I mean, this is a man who has purchased him. He's literally enslaved and still feels a level of loyalty to Potiphar because Potiphar trusted him. But he also, in violating the trust with Potiphar, would be violating his relationship with God. And that's how life is, friends. Don't claim to have a love for God and hate your brother. It doesn't work that way. Love for God will factor itself out in your life as loyalty and trustworthiness to your fellow human beings. So in spite of Joseph's firm denial of her overtures, Potiphar's wife continued. One day she upped the ante from verbal to physical. She caught him by the garment, saying, "Lie with me." Now, let's break this down. What did this really entail? Because we're told that he ran away from her, leaving the garment in her hand, and ran outside. So, what was he wearing to begin with? Well, entry-level servants wore a simple loincloth. Higher-up servants might have one of the skirts that covered the torso and thighs. So if he was wearing a loincloth, he ran away naked. If he was wearing the skirt, he may have run away naked if he didn't have anything under it, or he may have run away with a loincloth. But in any of those scenarios, it was humiliating for him to suddenly be stripped of his garment and running outside. So this is what she says in response. Genesis 39, verse 14. "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us." You have to understand, there's a lot of racism against Hebrews in that culture. The Egyptians were considered the elite race. The Hebrews were the lower class of people. They were really beneath humanity. And any time in human history that we have lowered a race to be lower than human, it has opened the floodgates of inhumanity upon that race. So she's no exception. She's expressing that here. She says, "He's brought in a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside." So there it is, a false allegation. You can see the enmity between Potiphar's wife and Potiphar in her saying, "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us." She's referring to her husband. So she vilified her husband even while she lied about Joseph. This woman is prolific. We know from the storyline that Potiphar became angry and Joseph went to prison. But my question to you is, did he believe his wife? Because if he had believed his wife, Joseph wouldn't have gone to prison. He wouldn't have gone anywhere except the gallows. So the fact that he went to prison tells me he did not believe her, and that it says he got angry. The anger may have been more directed at her, or at least the situation, than Joseph himself. So the story ends with a cheering report that the same thing that happened in Potiphar's house, Joseph flourished as a slave. And now he's a slave in prison. Insult has been added to injury. But the very same thing that happened in Potiphar's house happened in prison. God gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And Joseph, again, ended up a trusted leader. The last verse of the chapter states that the keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made him prosper. He prospered in prison. Say it with me. He prospered in prison. Well, you guys made a little bit more noise than the first service. A little bit. Okay, we're going to work on this, though. He prospered In prison, thank you. And that means that you and I, in whatever kind of bondage we find ourselves in, can prosper in prison. Thank you. What a beautiful ending to a tragic story. So, because I'm in abuse response work, I'm going to take this in a direction. I'm going to have to ask you guys to forward the slides because I forgot my thing. So, yeah. So first, I'm going to speak generally about false allegations of sexual assault, and then I'm going to show you how God can redeem even these horrifying, life-altering events, which fortunately are also rare events. The FBI says that about 2 to 10% of rape allegations are false. 2 to 10%. Now, that's not nothing, and it matters, and false allegations matter. In fact, as someone who works in abuse response, I want to go on record saying that false allegations of sexual abuse are a form of sexual abuse, because essentially what sexual abuse is introducing sexuality where the other person has not consented. And so not only are they a form of abuse, but they are a form of sexual abuse, and they are just as egregious for many reasons. They are harmful to the one lied about, but they are also harmful to the real victims who then find it more difficult to come forward. So I am very, very earnest about that. But they're rare. 2 to 10%, 9 out of, at the very highest, it's still 9 out of 10 that are telling the truth. So what is not rare is unreported rapes. False allegations are rare. Unreported rapes are not rare. Next slide, please. The Bureau of Justice reports that 65% of rapes go unreported. In addition, only 14% of reports lead to arrest. That's 5% of the total if you include both the reported and the unreported. Only 1.8% of reports result in conviction. That's 0.63% of the total. And only 1.5% of reports result in incarceration. That's 0.53% of the total. Really basically 0.5%. So let me illustrate this again with the next slide. You can see it kind of in picture form. Here are the orange is the reported rapes, and the blue is the unreported. And so go to the next slide. You see that when you include all of those rapes, the numbers of arrests, convictions, and incarcerations are so very low. Go ahead and show us the next slide. There we go. I don't know if you can see this very well. This was done by a ministry called RAIN, and it's basically the same stats. The first one is 310 reported to the police out of 1,000, and then follow it down to 25 perpetrators incarcerated out of 1,000. You see it right there in the graphic. So the point is that our biggest problem in terms of numbers isn't false reporting, it's underreporting. There are various reasons for this, one of the main ones being the difficulty of reporting. I've experienced it myself. I was preyed upon by a spiritual leader in a ministry context, and coming forward with that report was very difficult because the ministry leader was very valuable to our ministry. In fact, he was the identity of the ministry. I was more dispensable to that social unit, so to speak. And so oftentimes people will believe who they want to believe, not necessarily who the evidence backs. And so my report wasn't even really heard for a long time because of that. So I understand the difficulty in reporting. Fortunately, the Me Too movement has helped to correct this. What we find in abuse response work is that often survivors of abuse are willing to come forward if someone else comes forward. It's very difficult to come forward alone. But there's strength in numbers. And this is basically what happened with the Me Too movement. Some prominent women who had been abused by prominent men went on record with hashtags on social media saying, "This happened to me too," and they were popping up all over the place. And it became a very powerful movement. It was as if a pus-filled boil had come to its fullness and just burst out with all of this pus pouring out. But here's the thing, when human beings correct something, we tend to overcorrect it. So one of the taglines of Me Too was, believe all women. This is because, as I've shown, they're more than likely telling the truth. But we can't pass judgment on the basis of odds. Can you imagine the floodgates of evil that would open if we did that? If we said, well, the class of people that you're part of is usually guilty of this particular crime 9 times out of 10, so we're going to assume that you're guilty too. That would completely destroy the rule of law and the fabric of our society. So we can't pass judgment on the basis of odds. We must have evidence, and that's one of the hardest things about doing abuse response work. The fact is, women do lie, and they lie about sexual assault. We can see it in Genesis 39. See, the Bible does not teach that an oppressed group, which one could argue women are, is necessarily categorically morally innocent. The Bible teaches that all have sinned, that all we like sheep have gone astray. So women's often victimized status does not confer categoric moral innocence to them as a sex. And besides, if women are incapable of evil, they're incapable of good. It's true. You know, my dog could never run the mafia, but it also couldn't run a charity for homeless people. So to imply that women are these innocent little lambs and incapable of evil is actually insulting because it reduces our personhood. So I'm going to say this to you, and I'm going to ask the women in this room to say it out loud with me. That's insulting. Okay? 1, 2, 3. That's insulting. Okay, I'm getting some peeps out of you guys this morning. This is great. We're on a roll. All right, so I want to end on a positive note here. I want to talk about how God redeems the fallout of sin, including when we are lied about. What I mean by this is that while he doesn't predetermine sinful choice, God gathers up the results, the consequences of bad choices human beings have made and shapes them into good. He does this in such a way as to fully condemn sin while saving sinners. His redeeming of our sins doesn't at all condone it. In fact, it reveals it for what it is. But God doesn't end with pointing out our moral brokenness. Our morally broken condition creates fallout, which becomes the raw materials from which God heals our moral brokenness. The best example of this is the cross. What's the worst thing that human beings have ever done in the history of mankind? Typically, when I ask this question, people will come out with, well, Hitler, 6 million Jews dead, or maybe Stalin, up to 60 million Russians, or Mao Zedong. It's debated he was between 40 to 80 million. We'll mention all of these genocides. King Leopold, 8 million Africans. We don't talk about him as much, but it was a lot of people. Typically, we'll talk about genocide and despots and tyrants, these great tyrants of world history. But think about it for a moment. All life is sustained by God. So when humanity crucified God, they effectively, in terms of intent and motivation, killed life itself, including all human life. So in light of that, what is the worst thing that humans have ever done? The crucifixion. What's the best thing that God has ever done? The cross. Don't miss the point. The worst thing and the best thing are the same thing. The same thing. Say it with me. The same thing. The crucifixion is sinful humanity's choice to murder God. The cross is God taking that choice and redeeming it so that the most sinful act of human history becomes the most saving act of divine history. And obviously we see this principle of redemption played out in the story of Joseph's imprisonment after the false allegation of Mrs. Potiphar. Friends, all that Joseph experienced, including ultimately becoming the prime minister of Egypt, you know the story, was made possible by prison, which was made possible by a false allegation by a sociopathic woman. Please don't tell me that God will never turn your fortunes around. I will not believe you. If nothing else, your experience of being misrepresented, misunderstood, maybe even lied about, will bring you into closer communion and empathy with Jesus. Isn't that something we want? Don't we want to come alongside him who has come alongside of us? And Jesus' false allegations reached the sky. He was born out of wedlock from a low-status town, Nazareth. He had a demon. He worked by the power of Beelzebub. He was a glutton. He blasphemed. He caused social unrest. He was a tax evader. He opposed Rome. He opposed Jewish law. He plotted to destroy the temple. He falsely claimed to be the Son of God. He knows false allegations. Don't you want to know a little more about what it is to be like Jesus and to be in his situation? So like any of us, Jesus longed for social acceptance. He longed for understanding from those he came to save. And instead, he received false representation and a misconstruing of his character and motives. We esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted, but he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. And friends, the most devastating moment of all came when it seemed that God himself agreed with these false reports. Jesus cried out from the cross, "I am a worm and no man." We're told it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. How did he bruise him? How did he put him to grief? He allowed sin to occlude Jesus' ability to see the Father's approving face. And effectively, Jesus experienced there on the cross God abandonment, such that he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime and you do not hear, and in the night season and am not silent." Jesus' experience of God forsakenness reflects our lost state as he stood in as our substitute. He was made to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. His nation believed a lie about him. His faith community believed a lie about him. His disciples believed a lie about him. And it seemed like his own Father believed a lie about him. And he bore all of that so that he can look you in the eye and say, I believe you, I know you, you are mine. Do you love God this morning? I do. And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. May God bless you.